Thank you, and welcome everybody to, believe it or not, episode 17 of this series that we thought, I think we're going to be just a few, Donna. My name is James Connolly, and I'm the founder and the CEO of Castle Group, and I'm joined once again by our legal expert and shareholder at Becker Law Firm, Donna Berger. Donna, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
And as promised at our last episode, we did a session 2 weeks ago on hurricanes, and we're following up that this week with what if we did get hit, and what if we have to manage the journey through insurance claims and recovery. I'm thrilled to be joined this week by Joe Connolly. And Joe, as I said to you yesterday, your name is one letter off perfection there. Joe is the primary adjuster of Association Adjusting, which happens to be a firm started by the Becker Law Firm in a response to a need in the marketplace. And so we're thrilled to have, Joe, your expertise today. So we're gonna do a little updating first, and then Joe will come back to you with some very specific questions. And Don, I remember this summer you almost missed one of your episodes because it was Michael, your husband's birthday, but you showed up. And since it's my wife's birthday today and she's out of state, I figured I better say hi. And I had to show up because you did. So happy birthday.
Yeah, Kathy needs to be as understanding.
I know. I want to remind our listeners today that all of our last episodes, all 16 of them, are on castlegroup.com. Just hit on the COVID banner, and would love for you to use those as a resource. And if you need anything from us or have questions, you can go to info@castlegroup.com, including we've started to get some stories from you, the board members, and we'd love to share them. So if you have any situations that have happened in your community, especially if they're related to one of our topics, send it in. We'd love to discuss it in one of our shows. And then two final housekeeping items. Remember that if you get logged off and on, if you have any technical difficulties, best thing to just log off and back on, and you should be fine. And then finally, even though Donna always shares her brilliance, she's not sharing legal advice with you today, even though we do have some Becker clients on there, Donna. So we also have really had some great feedback from all of you on polling, and we have in fact we have one COVID polling just to see if there's been any change in our communities. And two, we've got some very specific polling questions on insurance claims and public adjusting. So the agenda today is a quick COVID update on what's going on in that world, a couple follow-up questions from last week's episode, and then we're going to talk about insurance claims and the role of a public adjuster. You can text in your questions at any time. I see them coming in now, so we welcome that. And I think, Don, I want to start with our COVID update, but maybe Marinesse, put up the first poll question for our audience, just so that we get a feel for whether there's been any change in their community's policy and rules for COVID response. Donna, while that's going on, the great news is the numbers just seem to keep coming down. Mm-hmm. But we have had a couple of things happen since our last episode. The first one with emergency powers. Share with our audience what has happened there and what it means.
So Governor DeSantis, James, has once again extended the statewide state of emergency in Florida, and this time it's been extended until November 3rd. So until November 3rd, we are under a statewide state of emergency, which means for our boards, their statutory emergency powers are still in effect. That means boards will be able to continue to close off access if they deem it necessary, to cancel meetings, to appoint assistant officers. All of the things we've been talking about over the last 6 months are still in play. And I know the question you're going to ask me is, should boards still be doing that?
Yes. Donna, should boards? No, I'm kidding. Well, first of all, Donna, I'm really, Governor DeSantis kind of surprised us. He actually announced early. He usually keeps us to the last moment. And secondly, extending has actually surprised me a bit. I thought, we're getting to that point where, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it didn't get extended next time, but it certainly gives our boards some certainty in terms of leading their communities, having those powers in their pocket. But look at two more things I just want to mention in terms of updates. Number one, the eviction moratorium has been extended till October 1. And then the phase 2 of the recovery in Florida has been expanded across the whole state. So yes, Don, I was going to ask you, if we threw all of that update in a box, what does that mean to our communities? And I'm going to share now the results of the poll before you answer that, because you'll see what our communities are doing. Ness? So there we go. We've had some increase in restrictions. That's probably in communities that maybe had an infection. Mm-hmm. And then that's quite a number of decreasing. So we are starting to do that, and then no change. But Donna, what the primary question as it relates to COVID today is, I'm on the board, I've got some restrictions, numbers are coming down. Should we be making any changes in our community? How do you respond to that?
I'll tell you, I was pleasantly surprised, James, that the governor extended the statewide state of emergency, because it means more tools in a board's toolkit. But that does not mean that the board has to use those tools if they can properly manage an opening. So right now, as we sit here in mid-September, boards have to ask themselves, can we safely start reopening things? Do we have the staff? Do we have the cleaning in place? Do we have people who can comply with our rules regarding social distancing? If you've got a number of things in place that would allow you to safely reopen certain things, then perhaps you can take those steps right now. What I would caution, though, is number one, you are not required to open up in the same manner that your local government is opening up. That's great if they may be opening up movie theaters, in-house dining, maybe even sporting events. That does not mean that your community needs to follow suit. Remember, we've been talking about this from the beginning. It's a case-by-case basis. And as you said, the people who answered the poll, the 7% who increased restrictions, that's probably because they have certain circumstances that they're grappling with right now. And that might be an active infection, one or more active infections. They may have issues with staffing. They may have budgetary constraints. So I think for everybody listening, the key is, number one, you don't have to mimic what your government is doing. You can't fall below what the government restrictions are, but you can impose, again, greater restrictions to fit your needs. And then the only other thing that I would caution is, we're in September. This statewide state of emergency is till November. If you're going to open up things like card rooms, little interior spaces, you may want to do so on a very limited basis, because as we head into the winter months, if our COVID numbers turn around and go in the wrong direction again, you're going to have to close them up. And you really don't want your members to have whiplash. You want to avoid that whiplash reaction.
That's a good point. I mean, there is a lot of pressure on our boards to open up and relieve some of the restrictions. Even worse than not opening up is opening up and having to close again. I think it's a good point. A couple other distinctions I want to make, just from questions I read in our follow-up surveys, Donna. I really think there's a distinction between outside and inside. There were questions, do people have to remain 6 feet apart around the pool? Yes, but if they're 6 feet apart, that's good outside. But inside, it's not. It's not that you can't do anything inside, but you really have to be extra careful with the appropriate partitions and distancing and whatnot. So I think, as we say it from the start, outside is way better than inside as we look to lift some of the restrictions.
Absolutely. One other thing, James, and I know we've got a lot to cover, but we're heading into meeting season. So I'm getting a lot of questions about meetings. Can we hold them outside? Yes, you can, and that's a great option to maybe use the tennis court or the parking lot or whatever you have, but you still have to follow CDC guidelines. If I have a high-rise with 400 units, holding an outdoor event where you may have hundreds of people show up is going to put you in conflict with CDC guidelines. So speak to council, because you're still going to have the issue, depending on the size of your community. Outdoors is certainly safer, but you don't want to violate the number of people who should be participating.
If we're having an annual meeting under the emergency powers, can we do it virtually?
Yes, we're actually having a lot. The problem becomes the election in a condo and co-op. The regular annual meeting, if you're, voting on certain things, we can do that. We can do that through a mail-in proxy. We can do that through online voting. The issue really becomes, James, the election, and there are workarounds that we can employ to do that virtually.
Excellent. And I know a lot of people, listeners have come in this week, may not have listened to our early episodes. And we're still getting a lot of questions about what do I do if I have an infection in the building? And I will tell you, we have some protocols for that. And really, it's just a case of providing that person with support in terms of getting in and out of the building and not exposing other people. The bigger issue, I think, is if you've got someone with an infection that isn't cooperating. And Donna, what do we do if we have a resident in our building that refuses to honor kind of the restrictions necessary if they have a positive infection? What are the remedies that a board would have?
Well, if we know a household has an active infection, James, and they are violating the COVID protocols, they're out and about in the common areas, I would suggest two things. One, get in touch with the Department of Health and your local sheriff, because remember, law enforcement has been empowered to enforce the DOH's rules with regard to quarantining. But also pick up the phone and call Association Council. We'll get a demand letter out to those folks right away. We'll let them know that we're going to proceed with an emergency injunction. It's going to cost them about $5,000, and we will be looking to them to pay for our attorney's fees and costs. That normally nips it in the bud. But the other issue is notice. When you have an active infection and you know it's a confirmed infection, you do have to notify the community. And we talked about all these things. It needs to be anonymous, but you can't just learn of an active infection and not let the community know that that's present.
Excellent. And I also want to remind my audience that we do have people from outside of Florida, and really everything we're going to talk about today is not state specific.
Right.
Public adjusting, insurance claims, it's really agnostic to that. But let's jump into that. I want to put a poll question to Marinette, just to start teeing up for Joe what our audience has experienced historically as it relates to insurance claims and public adjusters. And while we do that, the one question I had from last week, Donna, I wanted to ask you is, several people asked, can we use reserves for deductibles? And I know we addressed that last week somewhat, but comments, can our communities use reserves for deductibles on insurance policies?
If you get a membership vote, emergency powers do not allow the board to tap into reserves without a membership vote. So just remember, unless you have a specific reserve set up to pay for deductibles, you will need to get the appropriate membership vote before you use those reserve funds.
Okay, I think that's an important distinction. And Marinette, please share the poll results. Joe, this will be interesting to you. Only about 20% of people have had a insurance dispute in our audience right now. That doesn't mean they won't, and it doesn't mean, frankly, they didn't get a claim processed and maybe didn't maximize that. So that's very interesting. And then Marinette, I want you to put up poll 3 right away, because it relates to adjusters. And then that'll help us, Joe, with how many of our audience have actually used a professional like yourself. And you can see it's, oh, you haven't submitted. I'm looking at it. You guys can't see it yet. And so, Joe, thank you so much for joining Donna and I. Lots of questions around insurance and the role of an adjuster. Maybe just start with educating us on what is an adjuster and why would we need to engage one? Joe.
James, thank you for having me on today. I look forward to seeing if I can take some of the mystery out of the claims process. It is an overwhelming process at times. The advantage of a public adjuster is they act as your advocate. They understand how to interpret an insurance policy and then do an investigation to properly document the damages depending upon the type of loss that you've had, and then creating a document on your behalf to go negotiate with the insurance company to get the proper claim value so that you can do the repairs properly and bring the property back to pre-loss condition. So the public adjuster's role is to be your advocate. That's their primary role, and their skill set adds value to it. The insurance company will send out their representatives, and with their representatives, obviously they're representing the insurance company, and I think your audience can make a connection between, do you really need somebody on your side?
Marinette, please share the poll results with our audience. So again, about 20% Joe have used a public adjuster. So this is going to be a fruitful discussion, because that means 80% are going to have not experienced this. My first question is, who do you, the public adjuster, work for? The association or the insurance company?
100% the association.
And my experience with insurance companies is the first answer is almost always to deny the claim. And that seems to be when you start negotiating. But when should our audience call a public adjuster?
It's up to the individuals and their comfort level, whether they feel comfortable handling, depending upon the type of loss and how much damage is involved, how much needs to be documented. Ideally, I think it's always good to call a public adjuster initially. It's complimentary to have a conversation with a public adjuster. It doesn't cost anything. And to be able to get an understanding and get some of your questions answered, because every claim is different. So I think ideally you'd want to make that initial call. Even if you are still undecided about using a public adjuster, you want to make that phone call to at least start lining things up and starting to get your hands around what it is that you're going to be going on this journey of a claim that you're going to start on.
And you mentioned there'd be a free consult, but obviously no one works for free. How does the public adjuster get paid?
Public adjusters are licensed by their individual states. So there's a lot of different pieces that we have to follow, whether it's administrative rule or different statutes that each state has. And so public adjusters are regulated with that. We get paid on a contingency fee basis. So if there is no recovery, there is no fee. And the association, the policyholder, would pay the fee of the public adjuster.
Yeah, so, and I think our experience has been those fees are like 10 to 20%. So theoretically, for an association to that be a good business decision would be the expectation that a public adjuster would get more, 10 to 20% more from the insurance company than not using one. Is that a fair statement?
That is a fair statement, and sometimes it's more. Every case is different. I think what you need to do on that initial call is to see what type of skill set that public adjuster brings to the table, and whether they have the knowledge and the know-how in order to add value back to the process. And sometimes it's quite a bit more than 10 or 20%.
Is this just for hurricanes, or like do I only hire a public adjuster if I have hurricane damage, or could I do it on any insurance claim if I'm an association?
That's a great question, James. And everybody is focused on these hurricanes, particularly Sally that came into Alabama and in Florida. But a public adjuster can be a valued asset for hurricanes or any type of unscheduled event. And if you're uncertain what an unscheduled event is, it's really ties back into the policy. If you've got maintenance issues, that's one area that we wouldn't be able to cover. But an unscheduled event would be a fire, a broken pipe, some type of collapse, anything to do where something happened that was not scheduled.
And you're not asking as a public adjuster for an assignment of the benefits of the policy. All of the benefits go to the association and they simply pay your fee from those proceeds. Is that correct?
That's correct, and it's actually, let me extend that to who's the decision maker on the claim. The decision maker is the policyholder, so generally it would be the board that would make the final decision of acceptance. The public adjuster is essentially a tool that you're using to advocate on your behalf. They understand the process, they understand how to interpret the policy, match it up with construction methodologies based upon their investigation of things that they found. Anything that we can tie into an unscheduled event would be documented and presented to the board so that we can go forward and continue to present to the insurance company to secure the proper dollar value. But ultimately, the final decision is the board, not the public adjuster.
Interesting. Joe and Donna, I want to ask about how insurance and the board distinguish between what's an owner's responsibility and what's a board's responsibility. So Mariness, please put up poll question 4. And while they're doing that, Donna, we have these board members who volunteer their time. They hire an insurance agent and maybe a management company, and they get insurance, and they're not insurance experts, but they do have some responsibility to make sure that the association's properly insured, and they do as much mitigation as possible to minimize loss. So from a legal aspect, what is the responsibility of the board to first insure adequately, and then secondly, kind of pre-storm and post-storm, I guess, mitigation? But what's the responsibility of the board?
So this is where a lot of communities get tripped up, James, is there's a big difference between the maintenance and repair responsibility for regular, non-casualty, just day to day, and then who has the responsibility to repair post-casualty, as Joe was saying, an unscheduled event, that burst water heater, that storm. So in terms of maintenance obligations for day-to-day, on a day-to-day basis, you need to look at your governing documents. Each set of governing documents is different. Those documents outline whether the owner is responsible for certain things to maintain, repair, and replace, or the association is. When it comes to a casualty event, the statute comes into play. The statutes don't address daily maintenance, but they do address what the responsibility is in the aftermath of a casualty. Typically for a condo or co-op, the board is responsible for 4 things: drywall, baseboard, doors, and windows. The items that the developer built, that's how the unit was built. All the other interior options are typically the owner's responsibility to repair or replace and insure, as well as those owner upgrades, like the people who enclosed their balconies and made them into sunrooms. In terms of what the association has to insure as well, boards have to look to their documents. Some governing documents are quite specific, James, about the type of insurance that the association must hold, including requiring them to have law and ordinance coverage. And I'm sure Joe is going to talk about that as well. And the statute itself, 718, says the association has to use best efforts. So years ago, and I'm sure, Joe, you remember this, there was a whole problem with trying to get windstorm coverage because it was just cost prohibitive. So there were a lot of associations that talked about those self-insurance funds.
It's funny, I would like to share the results of that, the next one, just for, I had started asking about who is responsible for what, and making sure we communicate that. But Donna and Joe, one of my thoughts is there any way we can, I don't want to say transfer the responsibility, but why don't we give our documents to our insurance agent and say, cover me? I mean, is that a good thing to do?
Well, let me just jump in and say, in terms of communicating responsibility, in a multifamily building, James, there's going to be water leaks. It's just a fact of life in these buildings. So one of the things that boards can do, I create a water leak policy, and a lot of the Becker attorneys do this for our clients, where we clearly lay out for association, for the members, here's what you're responsible for. So many of them don't carry interior coverage because they think the board in the association policy is going to cover everything. So this is where it becomes really important to communicate to them, particularly in a multifamily building, who's going to be responsible for what post-water leak.
We just had a question come in real time, Donna. What about leaks in buildings? But you must have queued that up. Now, what about my big HOAs who have, I mean, massive, beautiful clubhouses or not? It could be small, but I guess that's just 100% association responsibility, and there's really no delineation between owner and HOA. It's all HOA, but I guess there's the same responsibility to make sure that asset is insured.
There's things we can do with the documents in terms of requiring proof of insurance coverage. I typically tie that proof of insurance coverage, James, when people are applying to purchase or lease. I put a requirement in that there be proof of HO6 coverage at that point. But I mean, I'm sure Joe can tell you in terms of your other question of what kind of coverage do I need? I mean, Joe, having an adjuster who would ultimately be trying to enforce the terms of that policy, to me, it would make sense that boards get help when they're making these purchasing decisions, because as James said, there is a wide range of skill set on these boards in terms of having any sort of experience with commercial coverage.
James, let me share that. One of the things I like to very succinctly say is, are you buying on price point? Or are you buying on language? And a lot of times as consumers, we're conditioned to buy on price point. And you have to be very careful because you're getting what you pay for. A policy is a fancy name for a contract. So you have a contractual piece of language here that you're trying to get coverage for after the fact. You can't go back in and get the coverage and backdate it. So you really need some support and help with a really good, strong agent to be able to make sure that you're doing all the right things to secure the proper coverage. And it's always good to have that professional do that. If you're buying on price point, you're probably going to run into problems, whether it be code coverage for your building. And that gets into a deeper conversation that how old is your building? If you've got waste lines, for example, that are cast iron, what's the age of that cast iron waste line? And what type of coverage are you going to have? Because there's probably a high probability that that cast iron pipe, depending upon when it was installed and what the life is, when that potentially could fail.
Joe, so should our boards be consulting an adjuster as part of the insurance buy decision? Because you're so expert on what you see in terms of coverages and non-coverages. Is that, like, I know our boards are going to their insurance agent, hopefully a good one, but should they, or is it common for them to go an adjuster while they're buying insurance?
It's not a bad approach. I do have people that ask me to take a look at policies, and I'd be more than happy to do that as a complimentary type of thing. I don't sell the insurance, so I have to stay within my lane with what my license is as an adjuster. The agent is somebody who needs to sell that insurance. So I can take a look and make sure that you've got the basic coverages, but there are so many other, determining factors that if it gets to be really, cumbersome where there's a lot of missing pieces, I might maybe suggest you take a look at another agent.
But James, could I just add, shameless plug, but a good first-party insurance attorney can look at your policy too when you're making that buying decision and tell you where there's gaps. For instance, Joe made the point about price, buying based on price point, and you know what? Where I find that to be the case with the law and ordinance coverage, Joe. So they may not take that law and ordinance coverage. If you could just explain that if you don't have that coverage, and again, sometimes your documents won't require you to have law and ordinance. The statute doesn't require you to have law and ordinance. You as a board may be looking at the quotes and say this is too expensive, but could you tell our audience what that means if you don't have law and ordinance coverage in terms of rebuilding your property, your building, and improvements?
Sure, that's a great point. And so let's just understand what the code and the law and ordinance, they're interchangeable pieces. What it means is if today's building code requires you to do X, Y, Z to the structure, let's call it the windows, and your building has windows that were installed back in, say, the 1970s or the 1980s, you more than likely don't have any hurricane protection. So if the windows get damaged as a result of, say, a claim event, whether it be a hurricane or whether it be a fire, what will happen is they will replace the damaged items, but you'll have to come out of pocket as an association to meet today's building code. So if you don't have that coverage, it could run into a very large overrun on your construction job. Depending upon the size of your facility, your property, you could be running into $100 to $500 to sometimes $1 million worth of code upgrades that, because you bought on price point, you don't have that coverage. You are going to be required to do it, and your policy will not pay for it if you don't have the proper code coverage upgrades in that document.
You know, I always like to highlight the takeaways from these, and I think that's a big one. You know, I'll bet there's a lot of board members that may not even know where they have law and ordinance coverage. So great question. A lot of interest in how a public adjuster gets paid here. I just want to do some rapid fire, Joe. If there's no recovery, does the adjuster get paid anything?
Does not get paid anything. Contingency, 100%.
Does if it's a small claim, would you normally hire an adjuster?
What you might think is a small claim could turn into a large claim. I'm working a claim right now where the insurance company has offered an association $12,000 to basically go away. And this claim is turning into a rather large loss, substantially more, because it just didn't look like there was any damage until you started, putting a ladder to the building and going up on a building that's 2 stories high that nobody likes to go up on. But when you start going up there, you can start to see the issues, and it's just a recipe for future issues that you're going to have to deal with. So you might think it's a small claim. It's always best to reach out and have a conversation with a public adjuster and see what it is that he or she is saying about a particular loss and the different questions you have. And it more than likely is going to require a site visit.
Yeah, and for the audience, an adjuster is not going to take on an account that they don't think they can have a huge value add or a value add to your community. So bringing an adjuster out is actually an interesting measure of the depth of the claim, probably, because adjusters need to make money, and they're not going to take on accounts where they don't think they can have some success.
Well, let me just kind of tag onto that, James, if I can. The right professional adjuster will take on a good claim. You have to be concerned with an adjuster. Possibly there's what they call loss consultants out in the marketplace. There's a lot of different challenges with some of this. You have to get the right professional person with integrity to take on a claim. Unfortunately, sometimes people over-exaggerate to the board as to what's going on in their property, and you have to be very careful and understanding of that. Sometimes you might bring in a construction person, even pre-loss, to take a look at your buildings, and let's talk about that in a minute. But there are some folks out there, loss consultants, maybe a public adjuster, that will come out and overstate what they're seeing, and you have to be careful with that. And I'll throw it back to Donna to talk a little bit about the problems on the back end for the board when they do that. Now you get documentation as to what the damages that they thought are out of the property. They're now in the minutes of the documentation of the board, and it could potentially impact a future claim. Donna, can you expand on that?
Yeah, James, we've actually spoken about the limited circumstances in which board members can potentially be held personally liable. We talked about it in the context of COVID and the COVID protocols, but it also applies here. Mishandling an insurance claim, whether you're overinflating it and potentially submitting a fraudulent claim, or walking away from a legitimate claim because you don't want the hassle of dealing with an insurance company, Both of those on either end of the spectrum potentially land the board in hot water. So this is one of those circumstances where the board has a fiduciary duty to ensure that they use the proper professional advisors to truly evaluate the claim, see what they have, and pursue their options. I would also add one other thing with getting back to the documents. Some sets of older documents require an insurance trustee. So speak to association counsel, because if you have that requirement in your documents, you need to be using an insurance trustee, or you need to amend your documents to remove that requirement.
Interesting.
Joe, did I answer that question?
Yes, so you have to be careful. You don't want to be on one end or the other end of the spectrum. You want to be able to fully investigate and make sure that if you do have a claim, file it and handle it professionally. If you don't have a claim, it's not always great to invite the insurance company out to your property, because they're going to take a lot of pictures and they're going to see a lot of things. And then it gets back into...
Yeah, and to that point, doing it alone, this is one of those areas where if my board tells me, if I say, well, why did you make the decisions you made? And they've discussed it with nobody except themselves, they are operating without a safety net. If they tell me, they've reached out for legal opinion, they've contacted a public adjuster, these are all components that comprise their safety net if the members start questioning them about the claim and how it was processed. And we all know that sometimes residents, it's hard to believe, but sometimes they like to criticize their boards, right?
Well, sometimes. So a couple quick questions have come in, Joe, and they seem pretty simple to answer. Do you do flood insurance claims?
I'll take a look at them. They're very challenging. A lot of people don't carry flood insurance, unfortunately. But yes, I will take a look at flood claims.
And what's the role of the adjuster in actually doing the repairs, or is there one?
There is no role. As I mentioned before, we're licensed by our individual states. Each state is a little bit different. State of Florida does not allow the adjuster to get involved in the repair of the property. They are very clear on that, and you have to be very careful who you're aligning yourself up with. It gets into assignment of benefits, which was a huge issue in the past. I'm going to let Donna kind of expand upon that, but you have to be very careful about signing different documentation, because sometimes you get locked in and it becomes problematic to resolve the claim properly, and it gets problematic as to the release of funds to be able to start repairs. Donna, can you expand upon that?
I mean, we've seen over the years, Joe, a pattern where we have a huge storm in Florida, but this applies in Texas as well, James, where the storm hits in a particular geographic location. You get out-of-state contractors descending, you get out-of-state adjusters coming in, you've got a board that is, under stress, needs to make an immediate decision. And what they're not understanding is that the immediate goal is just to protect the building from further damage. And that may just require, at the outset, signing a very simple contract to put up tarps. The requirement that you undergo due diligence when deciding who you want to make major repairs does not fly out the window just because a storm has hit. What you need to do as a board is take the immediate steps to prevent further deterioration of the property, and then work with your counsel and vet that contractor. Joe mentioned assignment of benefits. This was very popular. They came in and these contractors would say, it's going to cost you nothing, just to sign over your benefits to us. And it was one of the worst things that boards could do. And again, potentially subjected them to liability and breach of fiduciary duty claims.
Well, if there's ever a time, because some of these claims are millions and millions of dollars, a board shouldn't do anything without legal counsel at that level. I think that I want to remind our audience, this really applies every condo, every HOA. It even applies, Joe, to an individual residence. I know that's not the association's responsibility, but if an individual home had damage, they can also hire an adjuster to make sure they get their appropriate insurance recovery. Is that a fair statement? There must be adjusters that work just on single family homes and whatnot.
That's correct. So a single family home would be an HO3. If it's a standalone, that's an HO3 policy. You'll hear that term. HO6 policy is for when there's an association involved, and an HO6 policy is covering the insides, the furnishings of a particular unit that only serves that unit. I'll go back to the assignment of benefit real quick, in that the assignment of benefit here in the state of Florida was basically extinguished by the governor signing a new law back in July of 2019. There are still different forms of assignment of benefits out there, and both for the residential homeowner, as in a condominium owner, townhouse owner, as well as for associations. You have to be very careful what you're signing out there, because you could be signing away some of your rights. Those are legal documents that are very difficult to get out of. It's been my experience when I get asked in to take a look at something that is stalled. You really have to be able to feel comfortable who you're getting together with. Donna is exactly right. You know, the claim process, unfortunately, it's about slowing things down at the beginning, making sure that things are properly documented. Photographs, and more photographs are the key to a successful outcome. But really, it's about stopping further damage from happening, and then showing your insurance carrier and their representatives the damages as best you can, and then you start to get into negotiations. And so signing up with a contractor right away sometimes is not the best. Matter of fact, I've seen it many times where it becomes problematic, and doing just the basics to stop further damage. What Donna mentioned, tarping, that's really kind of the biggest piece to it all. Getting pictures, though, are critical, because the pictures will show some tremendous value during the claim adjustment process.
And Joe, let me just add, some of those assignment of benefit contracts that boards felt pressured to sign, because what they wanted to do was dry in and dry out the building, prevent further damage. But they got talked into signing these contracts. A lot of times those contracts went well beyond the scope of a repair. They included material alterations and renovations that were illegal because a membership vote was not obtained. So there's a host of problems with those.
I want to pick up on this single family and condo or co-op insurance. You mentioned HO3 and HO6, and Mariness, please put up question 5, because I have a question related to that. And this will be a little more condo centric, in that it's really not an HOA's responsibility, Don, I think, to confirm that an individual residence has insurance, but there is some responsibility in a condo to make sure you have a process to make sure that the individual units are insured. So what are the obligations of the board, and this is a condo only, to make sure that the owners have insurance?
So years ago, for a very brief period of time, 718 was amended to require owners to carry the HO6 interior coverage. That lasted for about a year, and then they took it away, because from an industry standpoint, it was hard for the association to actually, what we call, force place or purchase that coverage. I have some associations that have that language, James, in their documents that require the owners to provide proof of insurance. I would say speak to Association Council. I've prepared those amendments, but as I said earlier in our broadcast, you can also get proof in little by little as an incremental process. If you start basing your screening, let's say, on leasing, it's very important when you have when units are leased out that you have proof of that coverage. Why? Because you can have people coming and going, and one of the criteria you can base a screening approval on is whether or not that owner has HO6 coverage and has added the association as an additional insured. For our HOAs, I know it's not the same sense of urgency, but think about a community where you have a storm, somebody's house gets knocked over, and they have no coverage to rebuild it. What does that look like in your HOA living next to that? What does that do for your property values? So I wouldn't say that an HOA, they are a disinterested party In fact, I think the association is an interested party in making sure that everybody has the proper coverage. I just don't know how we do it in an HOA other than amending the documents or educating your people.
You brought up an interesting point. You and I talked about this the other day. A sale or a lease is a really great opportunity to confirm HO6 insurance. And the second thing, these are takeaways for our audience, put it in your documents, put it in as a requirement. And we're going to do a whole session, Donna, later this year about what we should be doing. Most of our communities haven't updated their documents in probably too long. And really, we're building a list through these 17 episodes of things they should be considering. And one of them, as on today's topic, is if it's not in there, making it a requirement. Is there any other way that a condo can ensure that the owners have the insurance in place? Like in some of our buildings, we'll literally go through an annual process where we ask for copies because it's a requirement in the documents. But do you have any other commentary? Because I have some questions here on what should we be doing as a board to confirm HO6 coverage?
So if providing proof of that coverage, James, is a rule, or perhaps it's even in the declaration, then if somebody doesn't provide it, it's a violation. You would treat it as any other violation. You could fine, you could suspend use rights, you could send it to the attorney to send out a demand letter. If it's a rule or it's in there. Otherwise, you're relying on the honor system. You're asking people, hey, this is important. But what really helps is that water leak policy. If people understand, hey, if you don't have coverage, this is where a lot of the pressure gets put on boards because people don't have coverage. So when the inevitable happens and they have a water leak, the first thing is they're yelling at the board that you need to repair everything, my carpeting, my furniture. If they understand that that's on them, and not only that, that if they have been negligent in maintaining anything for which they have a maintenance obligation, they may wind up being sued by neighboring unit owners.
One of our recommendations, May is our CERT month. It's the month we all get reoriented towards preparing for hurricanes. And most communities will send out a notice to their residents, whether it's an HOA or a condo, just saying it's hurricane season, have you X, Y, and Z, and there's lists. But one of those certainly should be to communicate what is whose responsibility. Because you have to do this at least annually because you have people moving in and out of communities. But the classic one we get, especially in condos, is there was a leak, it wasn't my fault, it came from above, and they are just shocked to learn that they have some responsibility for something that wasn't their fault.
I would just add one thing. Listen, our members can't control the weather, okay? But they can control how old their water heater is and whether or not they've maintained it, the valves, in the shutoff valves in their unit and appliances. So again, if you put out a comprehensive policy, in a lot of my communities, we put a cutoff date for replacing certain things like water heaters, whether it's still functioning or not. We know at some point these things are going to fail. So working with management and your end council, you can at least reduce some of these water leak incidents.
Yeah, I've got a couple questions on the board, Donna, about doesn't our E&O policy cover for board member air? And I know it's been a few episodes since we reminded our audience about the kind of the business judgment rule. Maybe just a brief update on that.
So the D&O policy will cover your directors for a lot. Courts give broad deference to boards in terms of the decisions they make. They're tied to a standard of reasonableness, not perfection. If you had to be perfect, we wouldn't have anybody serving on boards. But that being said, getting back to Joe's point on the potential liability here, if your board processes and pursues a fraudulent claim, you're not going to have D&O coverage for fraudulent activity or criminal activity or self-dealing. So those are the things you have to be concerned about.
Yeah. Joe, I want to go back to what we should be doing before and what should we be doing after the storm. And Donna, really maybe comment on what Joe's advice, because if we're a board and we don't do what Joe's about to tell us, maybe we're creating some liability. Joe, what should we make sure we are doing in our communities before a storm comes?
Well, it's a great, point in time to get organized. And unfortunately, your boards have done work a couple of months before a hurricane is announced. You're going to have 5 or 10 days before a hurricane hits. But you should have a decision tree of the board members. Who is going to make decisions? Who is going to remain at the property? If you've got a gated access, is that going to be manned? Probably not. If you've got gates that need to be taken down or opened, who's doing those things? You're going to have vendors in place to do all those things. What about all the other components? What are you doing to prepare? I think I've mentioned photographs. Let me mention that again. Photographs, photographs, photographs. That tells a really nice story because it showcases how well you've been maintaining your property. Congratulate yourselves and showcase that so that you can get your property back to pre-loss condition. If you're in a high-rise, what are you doing with your elevator? Do you have the elevator vendor in that expectation that they're going to take those elevators and put them on a floor that's above the first floor so that it minimizes damages? What about the furniture? What about landscapers? What about all those things that you can do pre-loss that you can minimize damage? The biggest thing is who is going to be at the property. That's a personal safety issue. And that is number one by far. If you have the different authorities in the area that's going to be hit by a hurricane, you have to listen to them. And if they say that you have to evacuate, then you should be evacuating. And what is it that you're going to do to communicate that to the occupants of that building? So pre-loss, there's a whole bunch of components there that need to get worked on year round so that you can move forward with that decision tree to make sure that your vendors are all lined up and things are being done properly to minimize damage.
I think this is really important point is especially with the ease of photography and video, there's really no excuse not to have done that. Don, is there anything we should be doing as board members in terms of documenting, minuting our actions before a storm?
Yeah, a couple things. One, date stamp. Make sure the photographs that Joe keeps saying you need are date stamped so you can prove your pre-storm condition. I think what's really crucial, James, is hardening the building right now. So we've got some deferred maintenance because of COVID the last 6 months. We may have some communities that have deferred repairs and maintenance projects. Those need to get started right now again. I had one community where the members were complaining and trying to tie in the set of circumstances with COVID, but this building has significant issues in terms of the building not having waterproofing, some of the windows failing. I'm sure, Joe, I'll kick it back to you in a second, Joe, but I'm sure that if this building gets hit and that's going to compromise their claim because they have deferred the maintenance, they have not made crucial repairs, and that is going to impact their ability to make a claim if they get hit in the next month or so. So the other thing is if you know your windows are failing as an association, you've got to take steps now. And as we know, under 718 in a condo, you can have your members vote and the board can go ahead and install impact glass as a common expense. So if you haven't explored that option, you need to. Otherwise, you need to start chasing the owners. If you're going to leave the obligation for the windows with the owners, you're going to need to chase those people to make sure the building is as watertight as possible right now while we're in the midst of storm season.
And Joe, okay, the storm's gone by. What are the first 2 or 3 things we should do? And last week we talked about pre-contracting with the key vendors, landscaping and flood recovery and whatnot. But what do we do to help you as our adjuster right after the storm?
Well, let me just make one point on the pre-storm. I didn't mention access to the different units. That is very critical and a lot of times is overlooked, something that has to be worked on throughout the year. You need to allow access because if there's a broken pipe in one unit, how do you get access into that space in order to stop it if it's a broken pipe, water heater, or whether it's trying to do an assessment of the hurricane leading into what you're asking now post-loss? What do we do? Yep.
I wanted, Marinette, throw up number 6, because that goes right to what Joe's talking about. And then Joe, you keep going. Sorry, post-storm.
Yep, post-storm is making sure everybody is safe. There are times when you can't get back to the facility, back to the property, because it's not safe to do so. Is the building safe to go in? You have to listen to the local authorities. A building could be condemned. Don't feel like, hey, I can go in there and I just want to grab some family photos. Your safety is your number one key. After that, it's really about who's making the decision to get a vendor out there to stop further damage from happening. Who's going to put the tarps up? Who's signing that contract? We'll let Donna talk about that in a second. And then from there, pictures, and more pictures to be able to showcase. I can't tell you how many times I've been involved in claims and I ask, did you guys have any pictures? And sometimes they'll say, oh, we've got a lot of pictures beforehand. This is what it used to look like. And then they don't take any pictures after the tarps are up on the roof. You're basically, I'll wrap it up with this. The insurance claim process is based upon building codes. It's based upon a contract, which is a policy that gives you the different language in order to go after things. But essentially what it comes down to is this: it's personality driven. And so you never know who the adjuster they're going to assign to a particular loss, and you have to work with that particular adjuster. And if that personality doesn't like things this way or that way, me as a public adjuster, I have to be able to change gears and present accordingly. The more information the board can give me to present, the more I can win over that personality. Does that make sense the way I presented that, James?
Yeah, and I think I just want to remind our audience, and Marinette, please share the results. There's two adjusters. There's an insurance adjuster and there's a public adjuster, and our advocate is the public adjuster. And there's an interplay between those two parties. But everybody, we are running out of time here again. It always happens to us, Donna.
Always.
I would like, so there you go. We do have some communities that aren't doing their key inventories, and Joe's point is we may have to get into those units. So it is good to make sure we deal with that. And also, Marinette, put up the last slide for Joe's contact information, because I know we haven't answered enough questions that have come through. But I think the key takeaways are this. We talked about preparing for a storm 2 weeks ago. Today, we're saying if you did have an incident, and we're all thinking about the people that are in the way of Hurricane Sally right now, maybe even someone on this call, although we don't have a lot of properties up there. It is really, really important. We as board members are not experts in insurance, and frankly, we as managers aren't experts in insurance. That's why you bring in the lawyers and the adjusters. And it's way easier to have them come in and look and say no than to not ask them to come in. So I think that it is important that it's an important topic, and it's a topic I think a lot of our board members, Donna, just aren't that familiar with public adjusting. So Joe, we're very grateful for you coming today, and we invite anyone that wants to follow up with Joe afterwards to do so directly. I wanted to say a couple things in closing before I give you guys the last word, Donna and Joe. Next week, we have had so many, for 17 different episodes, we've had a lot of questions about what do we do with owners, residents, board members, and staff that have so much anxiety about COVID and now storms. And so we actually have a mental health professional coming in 2 weeks on the 30th. And Donna, what I'm going to love about that is she's going to give us some advice, and you're going to get uncomfortable with that advice, and you can put some guardrails on what I'm doing.
Okay.
So there's a heads up for that. But Joe, thanks. Any final word to our audience about public adjusting?
James, thank you for allowing me to join in with the group today. My final thoughts are be safe out there. This is property damage. Safety is number one. Number two, all the hard work is preparing for the event that comes your way throughout the year. having the right policy in place with the right language. And then 3, always reach out. We're here as a resource. Myself, other people in my industry, whatever you need, it's best to always ask the question than to think you might know the answer.
Excellent. Donna, you always get the last word.
I appreciate that, James, especially in light of what you just told me about next episode. I would say for years we've worried that our clients are confused about this process. They feel that the cards are stacked against them in terms of submitting a claim. Some of them are often scared to submit a claim for fear of losing coverage altogether or having premiums raised. So there's a lot of confusion. I'm very grateful to you, Joe, for really breaking down the process. It shouldn't be as intimidating as it is, and it won't be if you have proper advisors helping you. I would add again, this is about safety first. What concerns me about the building is not so much saying you can't go in. I suspect we're going to have people who stay in buildings this storm season, and after the fact, it's going to be getting them out if the building's not safe. So we can talk about that in a future episode, but that's one of my concerns.
Okay, well, board members, thanks again for what you do every day. We appreciate it. I know your communities appreciate it. Donna, Joe, thanks for your brilliance, and we will see everyone in 2 weeks. Have a
Thanks,
great
everybody.
Thank you, everyone.